Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever the salutation may be. Welcome to the podcast, another episode here for your listening pleasure. I don't like when a few mess it up for everyone else. And this is, I think, the kind of theme across everything, man. Like with whatever you look at it around you, which gives you some sense of pleasure, gives you some sense of joy, gives you some sense of happiness, gives you some sense of annoyance. Usually the stuff that really, the problem is the stuff that it can work both ways, right? Like there are a few people who run with an idea and really sort of make it good for all of us. Because I wouldn't trust some of the, like, including myself, because like, just things. I think you have to kind of make a distinction with what tasks and what responsibilities or what things for humanity to go beyond a certain thing need to be kind of assigned to certain people, because I feel there's a sense now that everyone can do everything, and it's total bullshit. Because there are sort of the things where you need a lot of people to do it, like, for instance, maintenance of cities or roadworks or things, which of course very essential tasks, but again, it's a few designs come up by a few people. It's a few machines. Also, the ideas engineered, and all those things are executed on a larger scale through machines and through factories or supply, whatever it's called. And then multiple groups of people can use them, and then the few kind of become more. And then, of course, the same thing. Like it's the few can fuck it up for many, right? Like certain things. Like I think there was a certain set of things that were good for us, like the idea of communal gatherings, right? And I'm not talking about these stupid multiplex wedding halls which are just about serving really greasy food that gives you diarrhea, but I'm talking about like the idea of kind of connecting with other human beings at various get-togethers, if you want to call it religious or you want to call it ritualistic. And then a few people kind of bullied others into believing a certain idea behind religion or ritualistic practices, and then made it about how their particular rituals or their particular philosophy within a religion or a religious context kind of is better than others, and then you kind of turn one group against another. So I'm just fascinated because groups are something that I've always been a little scared of and a little averse to joining those kind of settings, because I kind of think there's sort of a dynamic that forms. And yeah, if you talk to some people, like especially in the armed forces, they swear by groups, right? Especially look at the special forces, the people who I kind of connect with the most, Delta 6, I'm talking about Navy SEALs, I'm talking about the Green Berets, I'm talking about, the SAS, my boys, just one of those. Yeah. The idea is that the brothers on the field, like, they never abandon a brother. And I get it, because I think when you're like that, and I was talking to this lady who does chakra healing a year and a half back, and she was talking about how even men are feeling very disconnected from the idea of a tribe and the idea of brotherhood, and they have these groups now where they go celebrate this idea of this primal connect with men, and they do all sorts of things like a drum circle, and they beat their chests and wank each other off. I don't know, I've heard it's, and it's a very straight group, but they apparently wank each other off because it's a sign of camaraderie, and I don't know, and that's what she said. And the thing is, when other groups form, whether it's in school or college, and then these groups kind of stay for life, right? Whether it's because, I don't know, because of nostalgia, because of no other friends being made, or I don't know, what keeps you together with your friends in school? I don't know, because for me, there are a few people, and I've always, more and more actually, I used to feel really kind of guilty if I didn't keep in touch with these old groups, which I kind of formed friendships with when I was in school. I'd be like, oh man, I'm not a good friend, I'm not making an effort. But more and more now, it's kind of, I make a conscious effort to not go to bigger groups and hang out with one person or two people at most, because I feel there is a structure which a lot of people enjoy, and there's also a lot of kind of barriers which some people enjoy, because you can't really sort of get past a certain level of conversation in big group meetings, right? Especially when you meet once or twice or 3 times a year, or for birthdays or special occasions. There's sort of a set kind of script in place, whether you like it or whether you know it or not, even, where you kind of ask how you're doing, how's work, how's the kids, how's the family, are you dating anyone, are you getting laid? And it I hate this word, but it kind of reverts to what that group looked like when it was formed, or when that sort of group was last kind of looked at. Like, you kind of have this one friend who's like the group leader, one girl or guy, and then you have one person who's kind of like taking the hit for everyone, one person who loves planning for everyone, one person who's kind of always fucking up, but one person who's always succeeding. And this is just very broad brushstrokes, but I'm just getting a sense of where I'm going with this. And I really don't enjoy it, because you kind of, when you do make the effort without feeling guilty, you go, and then you realize very quickly, you're like, oh my God, now I know I don't fucking go make an effort. And now, of course, you don't even have to go on in person. You can just go to these WhatsApp groups that are formed in these groups, for these groups. And it's the same kind of thing playing out. It's the same story playing out through the messages, right? Like, it's highlights. It's this one person who's done this thing, and everyone says, oh, you're an amazing person. You're such a good person. You're for what you're doing for humanity. And I feel, yeah, it's just annoying. I don't even think I have another more profound word for it, but I don't think it needs a profound word. It's just fucking annoying. And I just was never a person. And of course, you have people in teams and companies, and I think there is a certain bond in certain groups that are really, really fantastic. I think I meet some people who've gone to boarding school who formed these bonds. People in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or whichever other branch of the military. And yeah, I don't know where it's formed or under what circumstances, but yeah, there is some connections which are really, really amazing to see, and they kind of truly last beyond the changes that these people go, and they don't kind of confine the person to that particular version of what they were, but they kind of get past all these things, these stages in life, and they tend to have a much more deeper connection that kind of stands the test of time. And I think that's pretty fantastic. And those are the kind of groups which I think are healthy. But the other groups, I think, are just, I don't know. I think they don't work for me. But yeah, that's the weird thing in these bigger situations, when we kind of look at these social structures and you look at how people kind of function. But I was just thinking that they have this thing now. They want to find the super ultra rich, and apparently 5 or 6% of the tax on the super ultra rich can kind of alleviate 2 billion people from poverty. And I think fair enough, right? Because it's a lot of money, and the entire system, the economic system, is geared against the poor, and it's making disparity worse. And I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to understand how the systemic sort of movements fluctuate, but what I do get is that there are certain people who excel at certain tasks, at certain functions, and I think we need to celebrate is not a right word, but maybe we need to sort of acknowledge that and not make that a point of contention, saying they got it because of other reasons, but just appreciate the fact that if we didn't have those people, we'd probably end up with really shitty things. Because as a result of kind of making things equal, or trying to make opportunities more level, we're kind of taking away these really, really important roles from the people who really deserve them, and making the kind of mediocre acceptable, and as a result having lots of progress set back, and having a lot of key essential things that we need for safety, for progress, for just evolution and development being compromised in this so-called attempt at leveling the playing field. And I think that's fucked up. So anyway, I had no clue where I wanted to take this, but clearly there was something that needed to come out. Like a thorn that you didn't know was in your foot, hey? Yeah. And of course in religion as well, you have some people who are doing a lot of good work, and then their work is taken and used against them, and it's said, oh, they're brainwashing, they're doing all these things. And then you have people who are using these communal brainwashing techniques to kind of plant these seeds of hate, these seeds of doubt, these seeds of anger, resentment towards others. So yeah, again, a few can do a lot of good for the masses, but the few can also kind of fuck it up at the same time. So there's the moral of the story is, whatever's done is undone, and whatever's undone should stay that way. Anyway, let's move on to the conversation coming up, and that's with Professor David Voas. He's a professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Research, part of the group called the Religious Studies Project. I hope I got that right. And yeah, a sociologist is trying to understand the phenomenon of people dropping out and not subscribing to modern day religion. And we talk about a lot of things of the around religion, right? And it's one of those things where we don't go at each other's throats, because we're having a mature conversation where I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to listen, trying to make sense of where it was, where it began, the purpose of religion, the idea behind how these stories are passed on, the reasons for these stories, and how religion in today's context can handle some of the social pressures we're feeling as individuals, as groups, and where we are headed with the present structures of religion, and how they can help us navigate a world full of technology and virtual reality and online communities, and more disillusionment with a sense of reality, and how there's a growing sense of loneliness, there's a growing sense of despair. And where does religion and modern religion fit in? And can we, or will we see new religions or new forms of orders which create a sense of community coming up in the future? Well, I had a great chat with Professor David Voas, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to the two of us, mainly him talking and me interrupting. So I encourage you, since you made it this far, just a few more seconds to the conversation. And as always, I appreciate you, my friend, for tuning in week in, week out to this podcast. Till next episode, goodbye, God bless, take care of yourselves. Cheers. David Voas, thank you so much for joining me. It is a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
As I told you before we recorded, I was kind of had this longing for the UK, and I think the accent was one of it. I wanted to get the English accent, and I went to Swansea and came back with an English accent. People are like, I think you need to get your geography right, because the Welsh accent.
Yes. But, well, you might have done well to do that. But I love Wales as well. It's a wonderful place. In fact, I spent a couple of my own years of schooling in Wales.
Ah, lovely. No, it's, speaking of Wales, I don't really, and as you mentioned, clearly distinguish between religious studies and sociology and social sciences. But, when you read of the Druids and you read of these ancient groups and you read of people who were agnostic, and the Welsh do feature in there, and also the lot of the Gauls and those kind of groups, which earlier were tribes, which eventually formed certain nations, as we call them today, as France and Germany and Ireland, Scotland. But from a point of social development and social evolution, can we look at the word religion, and maybe in that context, can you tell me what the purpose, I wouldn't say purpose, what is the meaning of a religion from that context?
Yes. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask about the functions of religion. That would be the sort of term sociologists might use. Yeah. And it clearly has a number of functions. One is to try to give meaning to people's lives, to explain where we came from. But there's also a strong and important function in social cohesion, in holding the community together, and indeed in imposing a kind of authority or discipline. So to that extent, religion has always served as a kind of traditional force.
Which is very interesting, because when you now look at certain sites being discovered, right, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in Spain, there are a lot of these, what's the word? I don't know, these huge stone circles or these monoliths, which represent certain things that you just mentioned, which is the sites that people would gather around for a certain reason, be it seasonal changes, to mark seasonal changes, or to mark certain passages of time in a person's life or in a community's life. So we had these so-called ancient temples, for lack of a better word, and now we have the modern day temples, which are or rather seeming to play a similar function. But clearly the human awareness of the world around us has grown since then, right? So how has religion in that sense kept its role still relevant in us, in human life?
Yes. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you have these rituals, the ostensible purpose is to worship gods or to make sacrifices to the gods or higher powers. But in many ways, the social function is different. It's to bring people together. It's to give them a sense of what they should be doing. And it's to organize the community in a way that will help it to sustain itself. And of course, it gives people a sense of connection. It defines them as a group and perhaps draws boundaries between them and other groups. So you could argue that some of the supernatural functions of religion have tended to fade. That is, we're no longer quite so otherworldly, or our orientation is less to the gods than it used to be. But religion does still serve those traditional functions of bringing people together, of defining them as a group, and in giving them a sense that they're part of this big community.
And there is a certain benevolent nature to that thought, right? That we are going to take care of our flock in some sense, or we have a cultural context or a geographical context that a group of people can identify with, as a result being a part of a certain religion. But that clearly has changed, because people earlier who were, say, born in Jerusalem would spend their entire life, and their children would spend their entire life in that area, or people born in a certain southern region in India would do the same, because that's what life was. But now with lines blurring and people traveling the world, I'm bringing my cultural context, say, to England, or you are bringing it to India. It's happening constantly, multiple times, even in a week sometimes, or in a month, right? So when you have that, and you have religions which were initially created in these specific regions, and they remained in those specific regions, and in a way religion has also become globalized in that sense, and scaled up to accommodate millions, if not billions in some cases, right? So what happens, and what has happened as a result?
It is difficult, and this is where we get into difficult weighing up of the strengths and weaknesses, or pros and cons of religion. On the one hand, it certainly, in whatever form it takes, has pushed people towards benevolence, looking after the disadvantaged, instilling some moral sense. It's also, of course, produced some of the greatest art that humankind has produced. I mean, if you think about the temples in Tamil Nadu, for example, these are magnificent creations that are really unsurpassed as
Hmm.
human achievements. And it's difficult to think of modern people making the kinds of investments that ancient people must have made to create the sort of artifacts that we now see as historical legacies of the great religions. That said, as you say, our societies have now become much more massive, much more diverse. There's a great deal of social mobility. And of course, there are all kinds of activities that are non-religious that we're engaged in. And in those circumstances, religion can sometimes serve as a divisive force in keeping people apart.
And that's something which we see a lot more of, right? Because it seems like the aspect of religion which was the least favorable, which is the ability of a few to control many through various means, whether it's through ideology, whether it's through a sense of fear of God, or a sense of fear of the afterlife, and a sense of rejection from the good, and tendency towards evil. All these kind of themes reappear in quite a few religions, right?
Mm.
And even if you then take something like Buddhism or Hinduism, which are more philosophies and guiding principles to live a better life in this particular realm, as opposed to afterlife or any of that, that's also taken out of context. So the point I'm trying to understand is, it looks like there are certain aspects which weren't the most favorable parts of religion being now applied for different reasons. And the art aspect you talk about, right, which is a beautiful expression of what humans thought of their a medium to get to God, right?
Mm.
Whether it's the cathedrals or the temples or the pyramids and all these various beautiful representations of human achievement. And now it feels, and many of them in some case were scientific, right? When they looked at the meridians or the way the sun would hit them, etc., etc. But now it almost feels like science, art, religion are three very distinct things that can never see eye to eye. And that is something which, or maybe for me in my head, is that, does that tie in with this negative force that is prevalent in religion now?
Well, in a sense, it's a negative force for religion itself. So one of the things that sociologists of religion, that is to say, social scientists who study religion, talk about a lot is the notion of differentiation, by which they mean the way that religion comes to be separated from other spheres of life. So if we go back thousands of years, religion was there at the very beginning of social organization. Religion was very tied into the leadership of the group. It permeated everything that you did, whether it was art, education, the economy, all forms of activity were in one way or another wrapped up with religion. Certainly medicine and health were very bound up with religion. That over time, and particularly as we enter the modern era, has changed, so that all of those separate areas of activity, medicine, education, law, economy, and so on, have become separated and distinct areas of activity that are no longer tied to religion in the way that they were. And in those circumstances, religion becomes, if you like, free-floating, disconnected from these other realms. And that means that, in a sense, it's much easier to escape, because people no longer have to acknowledge the force of religion in order to go about their day-to-day activities. So that in a sense serves to erode the foundations of religious power. On the other hand, it does mean that people can adopt a religious view and seek to apply it, perhaps in ways that would not have originally been intended by anyone. I suppose I should be careful about words like intention or purpose, because
Mm-hmm.
I think often it's important to bear in mind that nobody thousands of years sat down and sort of thought through exactly what the function of religion was going to be. It just
Mm.
was. It was something that evolved naturally as societies evolved. And we can now look back and say, oh, yes, well, religion helped or didn't help in ways X, Y, and Z. But that's, if you like, our own analysis of the situation as opposed to some powerful personality sitting in the middle of a spider's web saying, I'm going to control people by using this thing, religion.
Yeah, clearly, I don't think that was, it wasn't like one man telling his son, "You will take the secret forward and control humanity." But when you look back, and I'm not too familiar with many ancient sort of texts or ancient wisdom which is hidden there, but closer to home, there are talks of the Upanishads or the Vedas, and even Buddhist texts, and it seems like those texts capture what human experience and evolution and thought had reached at that point in time, right? Whether
Yep.
be it in calculations or in astronomy or in health and these things that are captured and preserved, fortunately. And it seems that we have achieved a lot as a species, but it seems like we've forgotten a lot of that. So if the purpose of those ancient texts were to remind us, saying this is where you were at this point in time, so now technically we should take forward from there and add on to that, as opposed to using that text to say I am better than this other person, right?
Yes, well, this is the great tug of war between traditional and progressive interpretations of scripture and doctrine. So the traditionalists want to stick to these texts that in some cases are centuries or even thousands of years old, and defend every little jot and tittle as being the divinely inspired word. But that, of course, becomes very difficult when you're trying to apply some of these ideas in modern society, where, as you say, we no longer are even capable of believing the same things or behaving in the same ways. The progressive proponents of religious groups generally want to give a more metaphorical interpretation to these scriptures and to apply them to current conditions in ways that they see as appropriate. But then you get into these battles between the, if you like, fundamentalists and the reformers.
And that's very prevalent in today's current situation, right? When you look at religion as in the capital R, which is the cohesive or institution rather, or a cohesive effort to bring people together for some sense of connection, to now the double capitalized R, which is these brands that people fight for, kill for. Of course, it's been there for in some shape or form, but now, be it the Crusades or be it the Mughal invasions, or be it now the extremist, if that's the right word, Islam, or reformist Islam, or be it the Hindutva movement in India, or be it the wave of Catholic conversions, or as you are closer to home for you is the number of dropouts in the Church of England. And I just to comment on this, like when it comes to India, there was obviously, people refer to India when it comes to it with the Hindu-Muslim tension, which obviously has been there for thousands of years, also kind of manifested during the independence when the British left and the formation of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. What I don't get is, I mean, I do get it, but what I try to understand is how these waves, right, like the political parties using it, it's how can people, or rather, why do people um, kind of get so blinded, if that's maybe a right word to
Mm,
capture what happens? Because in India, the religions are like anywhere in the world. You have festivals, you have superstition in some cases, and depending
mm,
on the strata of society, you have all these various things which are tools of religion being used to control people, right? Whether
mm.
it's to keep them impoverished, whether it's to keep them ignorant, whether it's to keep them in your voting base. So, how do these things remain over time when information is so abundant, or can it be used
Yes.
to manipulate
Mm.
information?
It's very important, I think, in this context to think of religion as serving somewhat the same role that ethnicity does, or indeed any social divide that's regarded as important. So,
Mm,
um, in this case, religion is serving as a form of social identity that means people are saying, I belong to this group, you belong to that group, our different groups have different interests, and now there's potentially a conflict.
mm,
The paradox that I think you're pointing to correctly is that we would like to think of religion as being deeply moral forces that have benign motivations behind them. And in those circumstances, you would hope that they would encourage people to cooperate rather than come into conflict with each other. But actually, people are perhaps more affected by this group defining function of religion than they are by the underlying uh, benign ideology of loving one's neighbor or being good to the poor or avoiding bloodshed and
mm,
violence. So um, it, it's difficult in modern societies, particularly where we're so mixed together, to accommodate these kinds of differences. You know, one way or another, we have to learn to live together. What would in the past have been conflicts between tribes or groups, and of course, religion might in those cases have still underpinned conflict, but at least it was between a group living in one area and a group perhaps next door. Now we find that it is literally a matter of neighbors who might come into conflict because of these definitions. And yeah, you know, people can be defined in many different ways, but religion has historically been a very important way of defining our identity.
and the thing is, I was talking to someone about this, is this, like, say, whether you read a Buddhist passage, and of course, there's this immediate need for knowledge, saying, I know the texts of the Buddha better than you do, and becomes an ego thing, right? But
Mm,
actually, if you look at it, it's literally, if you want to break it down to the most simplest form, it's like, look within, right? That's where the journey
mm,
begins. And a lot of these teachings are, in some shape or form, exist or may overlap, right?
mm,
And it's telling a collective of people, how they individually can be better in this life in some way. Um, what is strange as a result is, you then now see people who aren't able to empower themselves in some way, whether it's through being overwhelmed by the environment around them, and maybe they're caught up in the rat race, and maybe they just don't have the power to be living a life which they enjoy, as a result being vulnerable, right, to whether it's,
mm.
if you want to call it god men, or whether it's priests, or
Yeah.
whether it's um, now the modern religions, right, whether it's these self-help people, or whether it's these cults, if you want to call it so.
Mhm.
Can you explain maybe the difference between how religion served its purpose, and now how cults are coming in and getting also kind of people, and then as a result using certain things that they think that they need, like say self-help and empowerment, to then brainwash them. Like, is there anything common between the two?
It's always important for people to have security, to feel secure, both physically and indeed emotionally. And
Mm-hmm.
I think religion has tended to serve that purpose, particularly in times of hardship or where people have grown up with a very precarious existence. Religion helps in various ways. It gives them community, and the community can be supportive. It gives them hope for ultimate justice. And the idea is that even if this life is hard, the next life might be better. So these are things that people consciously or unconsciously seek in religion, and the great world religions have developed to provide, typically. When people start to become more autonomous, to search independently for a sense of meaning or to explain the world around them, then they begin to go off in all kinds of different directions, and the traditional community no longer has the same hold over them that it did in the past. Religious beliefs and ideas start to fragment and become much more diverse. And in those circumstances, new religious movements can spring up. And sometimes they have very charismatic leaders. So the leaders will draw in a whole group of disciples or followers who then attends to this new community. And of course, there are groups that we're familiar with that have grown to be very large and in some cases powerful. But I think, as well as searching for meaning, people are also searching for community. And even amongst those of us who are educated and modern, we still have this kind of nostalgia for community. I don't know if you ever feel nostalgic for village life, possibly not. But I certainly feel that impulse, even though I live in a big city, London. I occasionally think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to live in this little community where everybody knows each other and looks after each other, and it would all be warm and friendly in a way that the big city isn't. Well, actually, I suspect that if I went off and lived in a village again, I would hate it and would want to escape.
When you just painted that picture, it sounded very romantic, like this idea. I've never felt that. I've always grown up in a big city in India, and we would meet the neighbors once in a while, but we had the idea of family coming over. And but for me, I'll tell you where the religious attraction stops, right? Because I love, as you mentioned, those old Tamil Nadu temples, or there are certain other places which are just quiet, and they are a place where you can maybe go sit down, and there's maybe a pond, or maybe if you're have enough time to sit down and close your eyes and maybe meditate. But a lot of the other temples are just almost like these garish, loud, the person who gives more of a donation will get better service. And it's basically a religion of consumerism, right? You get gold, you get this, and it's just so, I can't handle that. For me, it's just not that I am on a different path to God, but for me, I'd rather sit at home and kind of practice the other values of religion, which is focusing on myself and be a better person and kind of thing. Because I feel it's a lot of those ceremonies, those rituals are just being done because it's a tick box and they can show others that I did this, so I'm a better person than you, and all my sins are washed away. And I'm sure that's there in other similar themes in other religions as well, right? Having a really, really big bar mitzvah or having like a huge church wedding doesn't make you or your relationship that much better, right?
No, well,
Yeah,
psychologists of religion often distinguish between what they call intrinsic and extrinsic functions of religion. So
yeah.
the intrinsic functions are those that you mention of inner peace, of contemplation, of trying to find some kind of connection to the sacred, if that's what you believe. And
Mm,
it's very much a matter of your personal drive to find something beyond yourself. Whereas the extrinsic functions are much more public or collective, and those are benefits in terms of being seen, being regarded as respectable, or indeed as a distinguished person. So it's a matter of seeking social approval. And that's something that's, yes, absolutely, these sorts of traditional forms are also well placed to provide, because people can display either their wealth or indeed their piety in public
mm.
ways.
And that's the thing that bothers me is not, it's not about um, anyone's wealth. It's about the noise that comes with it. And I don't mean the physical noise alone. It's the noise
Mm.
of ego, right? It's the noise of subservience. It's the noise of um, trying to get favors, which is there in all aspects of life. And it was supposedly, I mean, and this thing you mentioned about the community, and that's what sort of I think my grandparents grew up in, right? There were 7 families in that particular village, and
Mm.
it kind of, you look out for each other. I mean, now of course we can go into other aspects like the caste system and each caste and how that served a purpose, but before that, I just want to understand, because for me, like, what I really enjoyed, say, when I was in Swansea, was walking down to the local pub and meeting people there, and that's in some sense a sense of community, right? Because
Mm.
you have conversations with people who you wouldn't typically with when you are a tourist and you visit these popular bars, because that's more of the, yeah. And I don't know if I'm trying to draw a parallel, but it's almost like the pubs are like the community and the nightclubs are like this new religion, right?
Yes,
Which is
well,
loud, garish, yeah.
and that's a way in which I think modernization crowds out religion. That is to say, there's less and less space for religion as there are more and more ways that we can spend our time. There are more things that we can do with our money and attention. There is competition from the secular world in all the aspects of life that religion used to serve. So
Mm,
if you have problems, now you will tend to go to a counselor rather than
yeah,
going along to a priest or a guru. If you need social support, the welfare system may help rather than needing to go along to the temple or
yeah.
have the religious community help. If we want to understand the world, then science is there, and that displaces traditional religious explanations of how the world works. So in all of these ways, and this comes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier about differentiation, religion is no longer providing those services and theories in medicine and education and law and so on. We now have specialist doctors and teachers and lawyers, and their professions are based in essentially non-religious structures that span all the different communities. And that's where pluralism or social diversity becomes important, because we need laws that apply to everybody and not just one religious group. So as the modern society develops, the space in which religion can operate becomes smaller and smaller. We have, in a sense, pushed it to the side as we've developed our spheres of activity in ways that don't require a religious foundation.
And what you're saying with the secular world kind of taking away a lot of what role religion played. I mean, someone being tortured during the Spanish Inquisition, if they heard that, they're like, wow, what a future, right? But it seems like with all this happening, what's left for religion to do is just become very, very unappetizing, right? Because it's what you eat, no pun intended there, but it's what you wear. Like in India, it's like we had this huge controversy with hijabs and how Muslim girls, had these protests that we're not going to wear it. Then the court had to rule in. And then there's say the ruling part, BJP, they're like, we're going to have a ban of beef. And it's boiled down to these 3-4 things that a lot of religions fight over, whether it's ISIS or whether it's the Catholic Church. So having that in keeping that in mind, and on the other side of the spectrum, with all these things happening, with the power of knowledge, with the power of the internet, with information being disseminated at such a high rate, with secular institutions playing such a large role, why do we see so many people who feel disenfranchised, right?
Yeah.
And sorry, just want to add the last point to that is then we have these new groups, which I forget the name. It's very prevalent now. Someone was talking about how a lot of boys go into these groups. I forget the name of this cult. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's this one where boys who feel disenfranchised go, and they are basically taught to hate women.
Oh yes, the incels.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So in both sides, the secular institution, which claim to give salvation or take away certain positives from religion and be positive in itself, and the other side you have the religion, traditional religion, with now going to ISIS, etc. So on both ends, we have these issues. So what is the future, if you think? Sorry if it was a loaded question, but I just wanted to understand it myself before.
Yes. Well, there's real tension, I think, between the positive and the negative aspects of religion. So, first of all, to try to paint the positive picture, religious teachings generally emphasize benevolence, generosity, helping the poor, being good to the people around you, loving your neighbor. Often religious people are, at least in ideal situations, self-sacrificing. That is to say, they put others before themselves. So this is, if you like, the religious ideal of the way of serving the higher powers that you believe in. But as against that, religions often end up being very divisive. So there are these forms of identity that draw sharp boundaries between us and them, between my group and your group. They're often reactionary forces. That is to say, they're so bound up in traditional ways of thinking and traditional forms of behavior that they come down very hard on anybody who violates those norms. And I think we see examples of that in Iran today, for example, in the protests over wearing the hijab. And the interesting thing, not to go off on a tangent, but it's not that most Iranian women do not want to wear the hijab. It's that they want to have the choice. They want to be able to say, it's up to me to decide what to wear and how to wear it. And they object to having what's literally a police force that tells them what they can or can't do. So in those circumstances, religion clearly serves as a force that's not merely defending tradition, but becomes positively oppressive in the way it operates.
And to contrast that, we have now the religion of the woke, which, if you want to call it a religion or a movement, which in itself is causing a lot of pain for a lot of people, right? Because whether you like it or not, the use of the pronouns, and like just how
Mhm.
you said, the choice, right? I would like the choice to use a word or not. But it seems like in that particular in that particular context, if you aren't going to use a pronoun or call them by a pronoun, it's almost like the same thing that it's like forcing someone to wear a hijab, right? You're forcing
Mhm.
someone to do something that you see as right.
Mhm. Yes, well, we're probably drifting away from whatever expertise I could claim in religion into other
Sorry.
areas. But yes, I agree. I mean, this is often a natural move when we're thinking about the ideological power of
Mm,
religion to then think about other similar ideologies in our societies that operate in somewhat the same way, and I think
yeah.
often have the same dangers.
And as a result, the reason I mention that is because we kind of always, at least a lot of us today, point saying, oh, because of the church or because of conservative religion, I'm like this. And they say there is no God. And you end up, I mean, you end up saying a lot of things as a reaction, right?
Mm,
But clearly there is something missing in the modern solution as well, as we just spoke about this the secular institutions. I mean, with
mm,
the rates of suicide going up, with the number of people who are depressed and anxious going for therapy, and the number of people who are changing their gender because of not feeling like they
mm,
belong. Clearly these are indications, and this is you more as a sociologist, I'm asking you this, in your work specifically, you're seeing a lot of people who are not subscribing to religion in the UK specifically.
mm.
So maybe can you paint a picture of what you're studying, and as a result, why it's happening and maybe where it's leading?
Mm. So I'm interested in the process of religious change, and to my mind, that is bound up with modernization. As I mentioned earlier, I
Mm,
think there's something about the process of modernization that creates problems for religion. And
mm,
here I'm quoting a well-known sociologist named Steve Bruce.
mm,
So uh, modernization brings with it a kind of prosperity and security, uh, pluralism in society, which means that we're living with lots of different kinds of people who believe in different things and practice different religions. Uh, Higher education has given us a much better picture of the world and indeed of societies around the world and their own diversity. And then finally, we simply have sort of personal freedom now to choose that we didn't have in the past. So all of these forces are tending to erode the hold of religion, and that's leading to a decline in identification with a religion, practice of religion, and indeed belief in religious principles.
mm.
Now, when uh, I say those sorts of things, or I don't have to say them, people just see that happening. Journalists will often ask me, isn't this bad news for society? Does this mean that we're all going to become immoral and we'll start fighting in the streets because there's nothing to stop us?
Mm.
And uh, one of the easier ways of answering the question is to point to societies that are actually very successful and pro-social, places like Scandinavia, for
Mm.
example, where religious practice and belief have now fallen to very low levels, and yet by any standards they remain amongst the most prosperous and moral of societies. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think humans have a great capacity to find alternative ways of achieving social cohesion and it, and indeed a different basis for morality, which ultimately is founded in empathy or a feeling of sympathy for other human beings.
That makes a lot of sense because it almost feels like it's going back to the basics, right? It's going
Mm,
back to the idea that gave that first human, this thing to find a need to belong to a larger group, and on the principles of caring and protecting and guiding and kind of facing life together. And that seems like that's where we've returned to, if we kind of shed what religion is, or rather what religion represents in today's version, with version 2022. But
Yes.
yeah, it's an
Yes.
update. I think it's like an iOS update.
Yes. Well, I think many religions, particularly the great world religions, have a kind of universalizing principle. So in Islam, for example, there's the idea of the Ummah, the global Muslim community. And that's, in a sense, a wonderful idea that at its best gives people a sense of connection to others scattered all over the world. But on the other hand, it can also be risky or dangerous to the extent that it draws a boundary between people in this enlarged community and those outside it. So I think what we're now hoping to find as human beings is a true sense of universality that connects everyone. And it's that kind of sense that we need to solve some of the great problems that are global, in particular climate change, for example.
And why, and how can we, when, whether it's the incel or whether it's, ISIS and or the Al Qaeda cells in the UK, and they're all saying, no, 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 you come in here, we have the answer. And then they turn out these people who just sort of hate a certain thing, which they're brainwashed to hate. Where does it all end? Because there seems to be somewhere it needs to go before it recalibrates itself, where we can work towards a cohesive world, which we need, because otherwise it's not like one person or one group can do it. So when does it all recalibrate itself to a sense of empathy? Because also now, just to add to these layers which I mentioned, there's also the sense of poverty, or going through a cold winter, or going through an inflation or a recession. So where does what I don't know if it's a question I need to ask you, but just this kind of picture I'm painting, which I'm trying to make sense of,
Yes. Well, this, I suppose, is a very sociological sort of answer, but I think that disadvantage does tend to push people to look for easy answers and often scapegoats. So if you have people who are living a somewhat precarious existence, who feel that their own security is threatened, it's not too difficult for leaders to tell them that actually their problems arise because there's this other group who believe different things, who are getting in the way and are in one way or another interfering with the natural order. And in those circumstances, you get these conflicts between different religio-ethnic groups that can be very nasty.
So it seems like it's with everything, right? With those, with like the attacks on the U.S. Capitol, to suicide bombers, to all these things, where it seems like if you have a place where you can't take out your frustration, or if you don't have a sensible or a balanced way to face life, there is a group for you which will brainwash you into believing something, right? And so you've clearly seen in some way where this is going, and you have something that you are working on, which you said is a religion in itself. So what is that model that you are presenting, or which is out there?
Well, I should say that I'm certainly not in the position of offering an alternative religion. I'm no kind of guru, and was it probably be in trouble with my university if I suggested that I had big answers to these questions. It seems to me, and this is in a sense the fascinating outcome of modernization, that rather than finding an alternative religion, people are able to live without religion. Now, this is something that is really a novelty in thousands of years of human history, where traditionally societies have been not only imbued, but even dominated by religious thought and religious leadership. So if we think of European societies all the way up into the 19th century, there were wars of religion. The rulers were defined by which religion they happened to belong to. Society was often organized along religious lines, and religion, as I've said before, had its hand in all kinds of activities, from medicine through education, law, economy, and so on. Now, all of that started to change a couple of hundred years ago. I mean, arguably it started to change even earlier, but we could really begin seeing the birth of a secular society from, if you like, the French Revolution onwards. And this is a major turning point in human history, that for better or worse, and, you know, I don't want to be making evaluations here. That's for other people, and people will have their own views about the extent to which it's good or bad. But for better or worse, we are learning to live without religion. And that's a fascinating development in the history of our species.
And as you mentioned, we now the future seems, in fact, in some way quite positive, right? Because it's no longer about what you eat or where you live or what you wear, but it seems that we need to be bound and come together by bigger ideologies, which are climate change or saving our species from extinction by doing and living in better ways, which is in more sustainable ways, in more harmony with our environment. And what will that take? What will it take, rather, to get there?
It will certainly take forms of cooperation that we're still trying to develop. This is the enormous problem. The world has by no means escaped the old traditional motives of nationalism and greed or selfishness. You still have groups, now often defined as nation states, that are putting what they see as their interests above the interests even of the planet itself. And we, of course, still live with wars and strife that in many ways are deadlier than before, because our technological capabilities have outstripped anything that was known before. So, you know, in many ways, the problems are even more acute and more critical. But on the other hand, we can at least hold out the hope that there are forms of cooperation that can be developed as people recognize that the problems are genuinely global and require global solutions.
I want to ask you something which is closer to home for you. Do you feel universities and academia in general have become in some way a new religion?
I don't see that universities serve the functions of religion, at least very successfully. I suppose they do provide a kind of community, I mean, both for the people working within them who uh, are a kind of collective, but then you could make the same argument about almost any workplace. For students, it can sometimes be a similar experience. You're thrown together, at least if you're living residentially on campus, with this group of people, sometimes people you didn't even know before, or have anything much in common with. And yet you do have this common purpose to study and to get a degree. So that's, I suppose, an interesting aspect of it. There's clearly nothing that involves the supernatural. Not sure there's any real doctrine involved at the heart of university. So I suppose I'm struggling a bit to make the connection, but maybe you have an analogy in mind that I haven't quite got to.
I think, the physical university, I think you made a valid point, right? It just happens to be like a corporate office, or it's just a place where at that point in time there are a certain group of people who are there for similar reasons. But I'm talking, if we go beyond the physical campus or a course or a degree or whatever it may be, to the realm of academia, which is beyond students who just come for a year or two, but it's the discussions that fuel academic research or academic funding, or these areas which in itself, of course, not in the conventional sense of religion, but it's in this group of people who are sort of the sharpest minds from society, having access to this knowledge which can empower the human race, but in itself being limited by virtue of not, in some cases, being able to be free because they're bound by certain other interests, which are the funding or whatever it may be. So I'm just trying to understand that, is there a way for it to evolve into what we need, which is this group that guides us through its knowledge and the power to find new ways of living more sustainably or living in a more harmonious way? Because by virtue, so academia in itself, maybe you can use the word science, which were always seen as the enemy of religion, can it become the new way to guide us forward?
Interesting. I think there's one thing that you point to that certainly is relevant, and that's the idea of quest. So traditionally people thought of a religious quest, and indeed within certain traditions you would have sadhus, for example, who would go off on a sort of personal quest of discovery and enlightenment. And the idea of searching for knowledge and contributing to knowledge is absolutely at the heart of what universities are supposed to do. And that quest is both personal and collective, and it should involve everyone from students through to senior professors. So I think that is an important idea, and is a great ideal of higher education and research. I would be drawn to the idea of senior academics as a kind of priestly caste who are going to help in the development of this great new way of thought that will lead the modern world into enlightenment. I think it's maybe an optimistic point of view, and I would hesitate to endorse it too harshly for fear of being labeled an egotist who is
no, I didn't mean put you in the corner. I just want to understand, because it seems like these are the pools from where you would find the right people to guide us, right?
Well, I think again, yes, ideally, these are amongst the best and the brightest people who are dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge rather than money or power. Academics these days have very little of those things, but they are, I think, typically dedicated to working in their fields. And of course, they have all of the human foibles of ambition and greed and so on as anybody else. But the activities they're engaged in at their best, I think, are socially very positive.
No, I mean, there's some signs of encouragement. It's nice to hear from you the work you do and the kind of where, and also just take stock of where we are as a society and as human beings, right? Because otherwise it's so easy to get caught up in the noise and kind of feel neglected, also feel like you don't belong anywhere, and it's all spinning out of control. There's no hope and there's nothing. So thank you so much for taking the time, Professor, to share and shed light on, I think as you said, one of the oldest institutions in, that humans have sort of set up. Really appreciate it. And if people want to follow the work you've done or the work you continue to do, where can they find you?
Well, one of the advantages of having a relatively uncommon name like Voas, Voas, is that I'm easy to Google, and you can find various videos and articles that I've written. And if anyone is sufficiently deluded to think that this is a good use of their time, then of course I would be delighted if they happen to read things that I've written.
Fantastic. So I hope they come your way, and good luck with all the work you continue to do. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me today.
That's very kind. It's been a great pleasure.